Welcome to the Horror Channel, where we dive deep into the darkest urban legends and chilling true crime stories. Tonight, we explore the terrifying tale of the original Night Stalker, a ruthless predator who terrorized California in the late 1970s and early 80s. His name still sends shivers down the spines of those who remember his brutal crimes. But tonight, there's more to his story than you've ever heard before. Sit tight, because this is going to be a harrowing ride into madness, and by the end, you'll see that some horrors never truly die. And if you love terrifying tales and bone-chilling true crime, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories like this. Now, let's dive in. It began like any other warm California evening. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the glow of dusk stretched across the suburban landscape. In a quiet neighborhood in Sacramento, the Harrington family was settling in for the night. Roy Harrington, a respected lawyer, was in his home office, reviewing case notes while his wife Marie folded laundry in the living room. Their young daughter Lily was already tucked into bed, her tiny nightlight flickering softly, casting strange shadows on the walls. Unbeknownst to the Harringtons, their every move was being watched from the shadows. In the backyard, hidden behind the large oak tree, he waited. The original Night Stalker. His predatory eyes gleamed in the darkness as he surveyed the house. Tonight would be no different from the others. He had his routine, and he had perfected it over the years. He prided himself on the meticulous care he took in stalking, planning, and executing his violent attacks. He was a master of terror, and he was about to strike again. As the night wore on, the house grew quiet. Roy eventually retired to bed, his briefcase set neatly by the door for the next morning. Marie had just finished brushing her hair when she heard a faint noise, a creak almost imperceptible coming from the back of the house. She dismissed it, thinking it was just the house settling. But the noise came again, louder this time. Her heart began to race. "Roy?" she called out softly, but there was no answer. She moved towards the door of the bedroom, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. She never made it. A figure, dressed entirely in black, lunged from the shadows, wrapping a gloved hand over her mouth. The last thing Marie saw was the glint of the intruder's eyes, cold, predatory, and void of humanity. Roy woke to a loud thud. Groggy, he glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. His sleep-fogged mind registered the sound, but it wasn't until he heard a muffled scream that adrenaline kicked in. He bolted from the bed, barely able to make out the shape of a figure in the doorway. The intruder didn't give him a chance to react. Before Roy could even reach for the phone, a strike to the head sent him crumbling to the floor. For the next hour, the Night Stalker took his time, savoring the terror that filled the house. He bound the couple with ropes, tying them so tightly their wrists bled. He forced them to listen as he whispered obscenities, describing the brutal things he planned to do to their young daughter. But what made him truly terrifying was his ability to extend the psychological torture. The fear he created was palpable, filling every corner of the house. Marie's pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears as the intruder carried out his sadistic plans. He murdered Roy first, bludgeoning him to death in front of Marie, ensuring her last memory of her husband would be of his brutal end. Then, after subjecting Marie to a nightmare of violence and torment, he ended her life in the same vicious manner. But unlike his previous killings, he didn't touch Lily. Instead, he left her alive, untouched, to find the horror the next morning. A survivor, but forever scarred. Weeks passed, and despite the panic that rippled through the community, the police had no leads. The murders followed the same pattern as many of the original Night Stalker's previous crimes. Carefully executed, no evidence left behind, and a clean getaway. As time went on, the investigation stalled and the trail went cold. Lily, the young daughter, was sent to live with relatives. She never spoke of that night. The trauma had sealed the memories deep within her, too painful to confront. She grew up, trying to move on, trying to forget. But the shadow of that night lingered. Years later, Lily is now in her early 30s, living in a quiet suburb not too far from the site of her childhood trauma. She's built a life for herself, husband, children, and a comfortable home. But the nightmares never fully left her. Every now and then she would wake in a cold sweat, the vision of her parents' broken bodies flashing before her eyes. It's a quiet Saturday evening. Her kids are asleep and her husband is out of town for work. She's alone in the house, flipping through an old photo album, lost in thought. As she turns the pages, she suddenly feels a chill in the air, and the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. A noise from outside, a faint rustling in the backyard. Her mind flashes back to that long-ago night. She shakes her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the sound comes again, this time louder. Nervously, she walks to the back door, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the swaying trees and the night breeze. She locks the door and heads back to the living room, telling herself she's being paranoid. But the sound returns, now unmistakable, a creak, followed by a shuffling like footsteps. Her heart races. She grabs her phone, ready to call her husband, when she notices something that sends ice through her veins. A figure standing just outside the window, dressed in black, face obscured. But those eyes, the same cold, predatory eyes from her childhood nightmare. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as the figure stared back at her, unmoving. She stumbled back, gripping her phone tightly. Trembling as she dialed 911, the sound of the ringing seemed unbearably loud in the otherwise silent house. 911, what's your emergency? She struggled to find her voice. There's someone outside my house. He's watching me, she whispered, eyes glued to the window. But as soon as the words left her mouth, the figure was gone, disappeared into the night as swiftly as he had appeared. Ma'am, stay calm. We're dispatching officers to your location. Stay inside, lock all doors and windows, and wait for the police. Lily could barely breathe, her pulse racing as she hurried through the house, locking every door, every window. Her hands shook violently as she secured the last one in her kitchen. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over, that maybe it was just her trauma playing tricks on her mind. But then, a soft knock echoed from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Her blood ran cold. She stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, staring at the door from across the room. It couldn't be him. Not again. Not after all these years. But the pattern of the knocks was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, mocking. Just like that night. The knocks continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then they stopped. Silence. Lily's breath hitched as she waited, every muscle in her body tensed for what would happen next. She backed away from the door, moving into the hallway, her mind racing. The police would be here soon. All she had to do was survive until then. Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered, once, twice, and then went out, plunging the entire house into darkness. Damn it! She cursed under her breath, fumbling in the pitch black for her phone. The faint glow of the screen illuminated the hallway as she turned on the flashlight feature. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. A creak from upstairs. Lily's heart leapt into her throat. She wasn't alone. He was already inside. She could hear the softest of footsteps, deliberately slow, as if he wanted her to know he was coming. Panic gripped her. Her mind raced back to that night so many years ago, how he had moved through the house with the same calm precision. She thought she had escaped him, thought she had survived. But he had come back. After all these years, he had come back for her. She bolted for the back door, her only chance to escape. But as she reached for the doorknob, a figure loomed in front of her, blocking her path. The flashlight beam caught his face, a mask of pure evil, the same cold eyes she remembered. The original Night Stalker. Before she could scream, he lunged at her, forcing her to the ground. She fought, kicking and thrashing with all her might, but he was too strong. He pinned her down, his gloved hand wrapping around her throat. She could feel the life being squeezed out of her, the same way he had done to so many others before her. But just as her vision started to blur, she remembered something. A small knife she kept hidden in her boot, a habit she had developed after years of paranoia. With a final burst of strength, she reached down, fingers brushing against the handle. She pulled it out and with all her might plunged the blade into his side. He let out a guttural scream, releasing his grip on her throat. Lily scrambled to her feet, gasping for air as the Night Stalker stumbled backward, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, but he was still coming. Slowly, methodically. Lily backed away, her eyes darting around the room for something, anything, to defend herself with. But before she could find anything, the front door burst open. and 2 police officers rushed in, guns drawn. "Freeze!" they shouted, aiming their weapons at the Night Stalker. For a moment he stood still, his eyes locked on Lily's. Then, without warning, he bolted toward the window, crashing through it and disappearing into the night. The police searched the area for hours, but there was no sign of him. He had vanished, just like he had so many times before. Lily sat on the front porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her mind reeling from the ordeal. She was alive, but the nightmare wasn't over. It would never be over. As the dawn broke and the police finally left, Lily sat in the silence of her house, staring out into the early morning light. She had fought back, survived again, but she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. Weeks passed and Lily tried to resume some semblance of a normal life. The police assured her that they were doing everything in their power to catch the Night Stalker, but deep down, she knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she noticed something strange. A letter on her nightstand. She hadn't put it there. Her heart raced as she picked it up, her hands shaking as she opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note. "You've survived me twice, but the third time you won't be so lucky. See you soon." Lily dropped the note, her breath catching in her throat. She ran to the window, scanning the street for any sign of him. But there was nothing, just the empty, quiet suburban night. And then, from the darkness, a faint knock on the door. Lily stood frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears as the soft knock echoed through the house again. It was deliberate, taunting, mocking her from the shadows. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The police had promised they would watch her home. She had been careful, triple locking every door and window, installing security cameras, and even moving temporarily to a new location. And yet, here she was, haunted by the same terrifying pattern. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was louder this time, almost impatient. It wasn't her imagination. He was back. She didn't know how long she could endure this nightmare. The original Night Stalker had already torn her life apart once. Now he was back, not just to finish what he'd started, but to torment her for as long as he could. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the door. She needed to call the police again, but what good would that do? He always vanished before they arrived. He was always one step ahead. Her phone was still on the couch where she had dropped it earlier. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and sprinted toward it. Just as her hand reached the phone, another knock echoed through the house. This time, it wasn't from the front door. It was from inside. Her blood ran cold. She turned toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. It came from the hallway, down near the basement door. She had locked it earlier. She was sure of it. But that slow, methodical knocking had returned. How could he be inside already? She tiptoed toward the hallway, every muscle tense with dread. The knock came again. Closer this time. She had no choice. She had to see if he was there. She had to face him. Her breath hitched as she approached the basement door. The old wood creaked ominously as she pressed her ear against it. Silence. Nothing. Her fingers trembled as they hovered over the doorknob. Slowly, she turned it, and the door swung open with a soft creak. Empty. The basement stairs stretched down into darkness, but no figure stood at the bottom. Just shadows. Had she imagined it? Was the trauma finally breaking her mind? She started to close the door when she heard it, a faint scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor below. Lily's heart lurched in her chest as her flashlight flickered to life. She peered down the stairs again. There, at the bottom, something was moving, a soft, dragging sound, as if someone was pulling something heavy. She squinted into the darkness and her stomach dropped. A pair of eyes stared back at her from the basement. Cold, familiar, predatory. Before she could react, the figure lunged from the darkness. The Night Stalker was already halfway up the stairs, moving with terrifying speed. Lily screamed, slamming the door shut just as his gloved hand reached through the gap. She threw her weight against it, struggling to keep him from forcing his way in. He was stronger than she remembered. His fist pounded against the door with brutal force, the wood splintering under the assault. Lily fought to hold it shut, her muscles burning with the effort. She had to think fast. There was only one way to end this, and it wasn't running anymore. Just as the door started to give way, she let go and bolted toward the kitchen. Her only chance was to arm herself. She grabbed the largest knife from the counter, her hands shaking as she turned to face the basement door. It crashed open with a thunderous bang, and the Night Stalker stepped into the hallway, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You can't run forever," he hissed, his voice a low, menacing growl. "It's time to finish this." Lily's grip tightened on the knife, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years fearing this moment, reliving that night in her nightmares. But this time, she wasn't the helpless little girl she once was. He lunged at her faster than she anticipated. She barely had time to react, ducking as his fist swung past her head. He was relentless, striking at her with brutal precision. She dodged and weaved, but he was wearing her down. Every punch, every swipe brought him closer to victory. But she had one advantage: the knife. And she wasn't afraid to use it. With a burst of adrenaline, Lily feigned left, drawing him in. As he moved to grab her, she swung the knife with all her strength, driving it deep into his side. He let out a guttural scream, staggering back, blood seeping through his black clothing. But he didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He charged again, even more furious than before. But Lily was ready. She sidestepped him, slashing the knife across his arm, then his chest. He roared in pain, but she didn't let up. She wouldn't give him the chance to recover. She slashed again and again, each strike more precise than the last. Finally, he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body covered in blood. Lily stood over him, the knife still clenched in her hand, her chest heaving with exhaustion. It was over. She had won, or so she thought. With his last ounce of strength, the Night Stalker reached up, his hand gripping her ankle in a vice-like hold. His eyes burned with hatred as he whispered, "You'll never be free of me." But Lily had heard enough. She raised the knife one final time and plunged it into his chest, right where his heart should be. He gasped, his grip loosening as the life drained from his eyes. Lily stood there, panting, staring down at the body of the man who had haunted her for so long. It was over. He was dead. But deep down she knew the nightmares would never truly die. Thank you for joining us for this chilling tale of the original Night Stalker. What would you do if a killer returned after all these years? Would you survive the night? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Horror Channel for more terrifying tales and true crime stories that will keep you up at night. Stay safe and keep the lights on.